Our vulnerability is the central fact of our existence. We are impermanence. We are embodied. That's the thing about being real. Being this body, do I see it as a lack, a constriction, or an opening onto infinite possibility? I think all too often we're aware of what we feel is a lack, a limitation, the imperfection of being this body, here, now. Our vulnerability, our aging, our not being the way we want this body to be. And yet, that vulnerability is also the precondition for our humanity, for our empathy, for our motivation. When I say humanity, I don't mean what differentiates us from other animals. This aspect, mortality, vulnerability, impermanence, is something that we absolutely share with all other living beings. All other impermanent beings. And in the traditional ancient Pali scriptures of describing the 6 worlds, there are the gods and devas who are, if not immortal, understood to live an almost unimaginably long time. And they're pointless. For them, there is never any reason to do today what could be put off till tomorrow or next century or 1,000 years hence. There's nothing to disturb their equilibrium, really their boredom. And if we think about an example more familiar to us, the ancient Greek gods, the Olympians, they are immortal, and they are truly pointless. They have nothing to do. They act like squabbling children, and the only thing they can really imagine to do is to interfere and mess up the lives of human beings. Hence Greek tragedy. And we might think in a more contemporary example of the sense of invulnerability. The invulnerability of the Olympians, the invulnerability of the Indian gods, the average Range Rover driver, and exactly where that sense of entitlement leads you vis-à-vis other road users. It's not conducive to empathy. It's not conducive to recognising the limitations, the sufferings of others as affecting as one's own. But nevertheless, and again we'll come back to Joko Beck's central argument, we experience this body as resistance, as what it won't do, as where it's not the way I want to be, or it's not the way I want it to be. This is not how I want my life. And the recognition of this resistance, this pushing of reality against how I would like things to be, is our central contact with the real, our central experience of what we often call in Zen the absolute. Without this resistance, without this difficulty of embodiment, no practice, no Zen, and no real meaningful contact with life itself. Sometimes this comes as a surprise to us. I got stung on my lip by a wasp this weekend. Threw me completely. Sometimes it comes as no surprise at all, that long-standing physical condition, or that triggered reaction, some trauma which we're only too familiar with the effects of, if not the cause of, intruding once again, changing life from how I would like it to be into the experience of something else, something different. So as we've talked about many times, our natural response to this, just like unwelcome thoughts, just like anything I don't want, anything I experience resistance to, is to try and take control of it. I can discipline myself. And yet, as this body, that comes to be a very particular kind of problem. Because, as Barry Magid's piece was asserting, affirming, better word, I am my body. And yet, between saying, I am my body, and I have this body, there's a world of difference, and that's the difference between non-separation and separation, between non-dualism and dualism, and between having an embodied experience of being this body and what we often call an instrumental use, an instrumental attitude towards this body. And so in each moment, it's worth asking ourselves, is this body something I am being? Or is this body something I have the experience of having? Obviously not in the same way that I have a house or I have a glass of beer, but maybe not altogether different from the sense in which I have a car or a new car. And how many times are there when, quite frankly, I'd like an upgrade on this body? I mean, myself, I've always been more Charlie Brown than Clark Kent. I've always been the funny-looking kid rather than the He-Man, the Superman. But we all have our own experience of this. Now here's where it gets a little bit paradoxical, because I can have the experience of this body, and it can at the same time be an experience that's one of separation, but nevertheless one of contact. And in a sense, that's what this central experience of resistance is. When I'm aware of the resistance of my body, I'm tending to move away. I'm tending to become the observer, the onlooker, judging. But at the same time, this experience itself is contact, is the possibility of non-separation. So we're not talking either or, and we're not talking good and bad here. But it's worth trying to think through this a little bit more. I mean, what causes resistance? Physical pain's the most obvious one, obviously. A limitation of mobility, not being able to make that movement, or not being able to walk, or not being able to speak. So many different things. And this is real, and this is suffering. But also, and in a sense perhaps more problematic, the sense of lack of perfection. This body not appearing the way I want it when I look in the mirror. This body not appearing the way I would like it to appear to others. I mean, maybe not even in the sense of, oh, I want others to find me good looking or attractive. No, but our responses to each other, there's no question how we appear. And how we appear to ourselves is always an idea of how we think we're appearing to others. And again, these are all part of the experience of this body. Whether that's at one extreme, the guy who walks into the doctors and says, this isn't my foot. What do you mean? No, it isn't my foot. Don't know whose it is, I don't know where it came from, but it isn't my foot. I mean, okay, that's one extreme. But how often are we thinking, in a sense, somewhat along those lines? And in fact, one of Barry Magid's favourite images of Zazen is that it presents to us a mirror. And as soon as we see ourselves in the mirror, we want to start adjusting, used as a touch-up mirror. What's wrong? What's lacking in this, here, now? What do I feel I need to change, to adjust? Where's my mind going to go with all this? And that too is part of being this body. And then there's what people are starting to talk about is the quantified body. I mean, this is something else again. And perhaps if we take the image of the smartwatch, the Fitbit or similar, and its exercise apps, its sleep monitoring, essentially I turn myself into a series of numbers. I experience this body as, well, is it optimized? Is it the best it can be? Could it be improved? And immediately I'm thinking in instrumental terms, obviously. How can this body be made more perfect to serve me better? If I get more sleep, I'll be less tired. If I break my personal best, well, okay, turn myself into some numbers more. I'm then the servant of an idea, and this body becomes the servant of an idea. And it's not to say that this is wrong in any kind of absolute sense. Of course not. If I'm diabetic, I really need to know the numbers on my blood sugar. I really need to keep track of that. And all of these things have their uses. Some more essential, some less so. But all of this is taking a distance that there's a me, and then there's this thing, my body, which I'm observing, and which is conforming or not to how I'd like it to be, or how I would expect it to be, or even how I need it to be. Resistance. So what our practice asks us to do is to take it down several notches, to simplify, to cut out. I always talk about Zazen as in some ways a laboratory. What do we do in laboratory conditions? We control the number of variables. We make things simple. Sometimes it's very complicated making things simple. We control the variables. We remain still. We actually concentrate on remaining still. Some ways of working with Zazen really are obsessive about posture. Ours isn't. Still, that's what we're aiming for. Why? Because we're just trying to remove the immediate feedback of movement so that we can actually notice that feeling that I need to move, that I need to adjust in response to, well, what? Some thought that the pain in my knee is this shape, this form. But again, am I doing this as somebody observing my body? Is this experience something I have? Or is this experiencing something I am? And again, all the words we could possibly ever use about this, they're just images, they're just metaphors, they're just trying to point to how I'm experiencing. So I could say, can I become my body? In a sense of just really ceasing to look at it as something over there, but just simply be this experience. But maybe that sounds too intentional. Could I allow myself to be my body? Could I just simply be this body? And again, as always, it's important to realise that I'm not trying to get down to some fundamental fine-grained level that if I really, if I really observe, if I really concentrate, if I really notice each minute sensation, that I'm in some ways more being this body. Quite probable that I'm actually just observing more and I'm actually holding myself more separate. And again, this isn't an either-or thing. It isn't a right or wrong thing. It's just to what extent in this moment, and this moment, and this moment, is there simply this experiencing, and how far am I separating it out into a body and the experiencer, the observer. And that's something which I can become aware of and lose awareness of. And then in my awareness of, I realise that that's a form of separation. And it's a process, and it's a dynamic process. And this is one aspect of what's going on in our Zazen. Because simply being offers us the direct experiencing of non-separation in a way that it's barely even experienced, because there's no separate experienced and no experiencer. And the kind of words I usually use and bring to this: kindness, care, tolerance. These are all the kind of virtues that undermine what seems to be quite a universal tendency for us to, as soon as we're there, we're judging. As soon as we're there, we're drawing away, because there's not knowing, to use another term that we keep coming back to. There's uncertainty. There's simply this. Curiosity. Curiosity about my experiencing. Not in a poking, investigative sense, but just, this and this. And I mentioned trauma above. And one of the things that trauma tends to do, because something triggers us and we go into overwhelm, and okay. There's big trauma like PTSD, but these days I think we're recognising that developmental trauma that we pick up during childhood one way and another is pretty much universal. And for all of us, there are minor and major triggers. And what's the common result of all these different experiences? It's a withdrawal, a separation from this body. And so one approach to treating trauma, and I'm thinking particularly of the work of Peter Levine here, but common and widespread, is reintegration of this experiencing as body towards non-separation. And he has many strategies for this, but one which I really liked was simply experiencing in the shower the play of water, playing with water jets, feeling water on skin, differences of temperature, differences of pressure, pattern, rhythm. And that moves us in the direction of a way in which we so rarely talk in Zen, which is, we talk about suffering because, yeah, that's our core business. But we could also talk about pleasure, about what brings us pleasure. And if we get away from our preconceptions of what pleasure ought to be, pleasure can be unbelievably simple. What brings us simple pleasure? What kind of experiencing? And I think Levine's example of the shower is a really nice one. It's so simple. Actually just the touch of skin on skin. Simple pleasure. Or, well, take a bigger example, movement. It might be dance. There are so many ways to allow the body to just engage with pleasure. And if we can directly allow ourselves, really experience that, there's infinite possibilities of non-separation just here, this simple letting go of experiencer and experienced, and simply being the dance, being the touch of skin, being whatever embodied activity, action. And so all this is our Zazen, all this enters into it. And we can become aware, again, sometimes as observer, sometimes not, sometimes aware of our separation, sometimes sort of aware that the separation simply doesn't seem to be there. Shifting, moment by moment. Bliss, boredom, agony, whatever, just as the pattern of this Zazen unfolds moment by moment. Separate and not separate. Our practice being just this.